Roman, and on behalf of the Hispanic Caucus, I'd like to welcome everyone to our forum event tonight, Serving the Homeless, Innovative Approaches, Serving the Homeless, Creative Policy Approaches in the 90s. And I'd first like to start off thanking all of the organizations that were involved in putting this event together. The Kennedy School Hispanic Caucus, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, the Health, Education, Labor, Poverty, Professional Interest Council here at the Kennedy School, the Boricua Health Organization and the Chicano Health Organization at the School of Medicine, and HISPAN at the Harvard School of Public Health, as well as the Forum Office. Julie Wilson will be our moderator this evening. Ms. Wilson is the co-director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and she's also a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School.
I'd like to join Ruth in welcoming everyone. One of the most exciting things about being at the Kennedy School and participating in the events here is that you get an opportunity to speak with many people who not only have a vision for how to make the country better and how to improve the lives of people, but people who act on that vision in ways that most of us only aspire to do. And tonight we're very privileged to have three people who have an extraordinary vision and who have each done enormous jobs in their respective communities. They've been not only working hard at very traditional means, but thinking as they've been going about new and innovative ways to address the problem of homelessness. And so we're here tonight first to listen to them and then to have a dialogue among all of us so that we can raise some of the issues. By way of introducing the topic, though, I'd like to say just a couple of things about homelessness. And it's not going to be statistics. We all know a lot of statistics. We've all seen a lot of homeless people. But I'd like to put the issue in perspective by focusing on it from several other different angles. First of all, I would like us to remember that there is enormous variety in the homeless population. You can all think of various groups of the homeless. There are the mentally ill homeless, there are the substance abusing homeless, there are those who are the victims of domestic violence, those who have been burned out of homes, who have been evicted, those who are working but can't earn enough to get into a home, a wide variety of homeless individuals. And consequently, it's very difficult to talk about the homeless person and have the homeless policy. Often what happens, however, is people who are in the business of serving the homeless define and identify the homeless population from their own perspective. The most vivid example of this I have is interviewing a homeless teenage mother with someone who was a psychologist. And the psychologist came out of the interview thinking and saying, what a narcissistic individual. Not being a psychologist, I wasn't quite sure what it meant. I, on the other hand, thought this person was quite rational because she has said quite flatly to us, the way I could get a housing subsidy was to go into a homeless shelter for 6 months. I thought it was worth it to raise my child in a community where the schools were good. So that there are not only a variety of homeless people, but we tend to see what we want to see from our perspective. I'd like us all to be aware of that tonight as we get started and try to look at this more creatively. Second, the concern, of course, is that the homeless population has grown enormously. It seems to be, to some extent, impervious to changes in the economy. It certainly is sensitive to some changes in public policy, lack of or diminution of housing subsidies, loss of certain types of housing in our community. It's not clear, though, how we respond to reduce the population of the homeless and what these responses ought to be. And that's what tonight is all about. It's also a period for us of enormous hope, having heard Clinton's first State of the Union address last night. But I think we need to be cautious as we talk about a period of investment, a period of change. The investment and the change had nothing to do with the homeless population. It was investment in the youth of America, an investment in the workers of America, and I think those of us who are concerned about the issues of homelessness are concerned that in investing in some of these groups, this large group of homeless people will be written off as a problem we can't solve, so we're going to salvage the rest of what we can. So tonight, for three people who have some very creative and interesting ways to address this and have worked very hard, we're going to get to hear from them. First, we're going to hear from Joe Greer, and I'm going to give reasonably short introductions because I think each of the speakers is going to weave a bit of his or her background into the presentation. But Joe Greer is the Assistant Dean for Homeless Education at the University of Miami School of Medicine. He's having a bit of trouble with our weather.
A lot.
And he's the medical director of Camilla's Health Concern, which is a homeless health care clinic that treats over 25,000 patients annually for free. He continues to make house calls to the homeless in Miami under the bridges. He has set up a number of other health clinics and health centers throughout the Miami region. The child of Cuban immigrants, were you actually born here or in Cuba?
I was born here, then I went back to Cuba, and then I came here. We got it all wrong. I was born in '56, and we went back to Cuba, came back in '60.
Okay, he has a special affinity for the Cuban community, but has spoken quite eloquently, certainly we were discussing this at dinner, of the needs of the variety of ethnic communities in Miami, the differences across the cultural groups, and the needs for sensitivity in human services. So, Joe?
Thank you. My background, my name is Pedro Jose Greer, that's Cuban Irish, and so I said it always comes from one small Catholic corrupt island to another, and that was the background of our migration. I'd like to thank everybody and all the organizations for the invitation, particularly Frank. I also like to say hi to Jim O'Connell, who's an old friend, and the first person I ever heard lecture on homeless health issues in San Diego, California. I'm not going to say when, Jim, because that'll date you, but who has one of the most remarkable and innovative programs in the country. It's something to look at. I'm going to start off by saying that I've been dealing with the homeless now for about 9 years. And thinking back on it, I think one of the problems that we've made, those of us that work with the homeless, is using the word homeless. And I think that's a big mistake for two reasons. We live in a very judgmental society, so we've labeled a group that now we can judge. And number two, we simplified the issue of homelessness into an issue of purely housing. So it's a group that's separate, and all they need is a house because obviously they're just homeless. Where the reality is we're dealing with a large picture of poverty, poverty being a relative term, and as my wife constantly reminds me that we're poor compared to surgeons, that the homeless becomes an absolute of poverty and one of the end parts of that spectrum. So as you are going to make policies or decisions or do public speaking with your roles out there, be careful in the terms you use and their consequences in the long term. Be very objective, because don't box yourself in so that when you turn around, all of a sudden everybody judges these individuals, and now the homeless is something that everybody thinks they know what it is without realizing the diversity of homelessness and poverty is no different than the diversity of our country. There's an analogy in public health that is, imagine a river and an individual at the edge of that river being a healthcare provider, and a body floats by and you resuscitate it. 5 more float by, you become a little tired. 1,000 float by, you build a clinic. 10,000 float by, you build a hospital. 1 million float by, you build Mass General for that matter. And those of us that work in that arena down the river, because that's what we're trained to do as doctors, we're trained to be disease interveners, start to ask the question, why doesn't society just fix the bridge? Why do we deal with the homeless issue? Why is the problem the homeless? Isn't the problem much greater and further upstream? Are we going to deal with it by building more shelters this year and then more the next year and then more the year after that? Or are we going to do something to stop that flow of human poverty that keeps flowing by there? And if that's what we're going to really deal with it, then that's what we need to do. My perspective is from way down the river. I deal with disease and I deal with death or dying. So that's where I see the consequences of these lack of policies or inappropriate policies and policy decisions that don't properly address the issues. The consequences of these are human suffering. And we sit in a country where we want equal health for everybody, but not equal living for everybody, which is somewhat of an interesting phenomenon to me. I mean, it's sort of like in America you can suffer, but you can't die. Okay, go ahead, you could be like real unhappy and real sick, but we'll transplant you, but then we'll send you right back into the shelter or the inner city or wherever it is. So we have to start looking at the realities. And the reality is you can't have equal health in an unequal society. A homeless person in Miami under 395, which is our expressway, cannot, if he's a diabetic, go home or under the bridge with his bag of syringes. They are not going to last for a very long time. We have an American Diabetic Association diet for Americans that have diabetes. But if you live in the inner city, if you're a farm worker, if you're homeless, do you think you're going to be able to follow that diet? In our homeless clinic, we don't draw cholesterol levels. Nobody's going to change their diet. So we expect equal treatment without offering people the equal opportunities to be able to deal with them. And then we come down to the issue now where we're saying everybody should have health insurance. Do you think if a homeless person had health insurance, it would make a difference? Do you think if a single mother in the projects with 3 children that has to punch in and punch out at the end of the day has health insurance, she's going to take a day off of work and make 20% less this week just to turn around and get her mammography done or her checkup? Or do you think her concerns are much deeper than that, sort of survival and making sure my family gets what they need? So when we try to address these issues and you hear these things coming down the pipe, remember the diversity this country has, and it's just not a cultural or racial diversity. It's also a diversity of education. It's a diversity of income. It's a diversity of transportation. We have the Metro Rail system in Miami. It costs $1 a person. That mother with 3 kids, it's going to cost her $8 to come see a doctor and $8 to get home. Plus that loss of day of work, no matter how much insurance she has. So think about these issues and what they really mean. Or do we turn around and set all our values from middle class backgrounds, because that's where it affects us in the middle class, is that we don't have the insurance, so we're going to apply that to the homeless and the poor. And when we talk about the homeless, the examples I'm going to give you is because that's the group we've worked most closely with on our organizations in Miami, and that's the examples we have. What we have done is, first of all, I believe that policy in dealing with the homeless, you need federal financial assistance, but local policies to deal with the issues. Why is that? Because Cambridge, although not that much different than Miami, that's not true, it is a lot different. Is you have different municipalities, different governments, different politics, different funding, different ways of dealing with the problems, and a different population that comes in. You don't have the mass immigration that we have in Miami. You have individuals here that are coming from more rural areas that come into here, so you deal with things in a different way. You have a different school board. You have a different city commission, or whatever you call it over here. You have a different state government, county governments. So you have to set your policies depending on what you have within your communities. Obviously, you have, different public school systems in Massachusetts than we have in Florida, or at least you have a public school system in Massachusetts as opposed to what we have in Florida. So you have a system that you can start off with and work with and deal with, but in Miami you don't. So the policies you set here are not applicable to what we do in Miami. So if you're going to set up a health system, which is dealing way down the river for the poor or the homeless, we have to work outside the square. Obviously, if public health in America was working today, we wouldn't have the problems we have. So we got to start thinking outside these traditional confines and turn around and apply to what the patient needs, adapt to their needs. Or are we going to turn around and say, look, I went to medical school, or I went here and I did this, and our hours are 9 to 4 and I'm the doctor, so come on in. Oh, you didn't come in? You had your chance. Or are we going to turn around and say, well, wait, there's a problem. Why aren't they coming in? Learn what the patient needs and apply to it. In our clinic, we don't take Medicaid. The reason we don't take Medicaid, because it's horrible in Florida, number one, and I have a philosophical problem with Medicaid. We sign our families up for it, but the problem is the relationship with the patient is the most valuable aspect of patient care, but we're turning around and looking at somebody and saying, hey, prove to me you're real poor. And after you prove to me you're real poor, then I'll give you health care. What a wonderful thing to say in a capitalistic society where we look down on the poor. And we consider poverty as a failure. And we think that people that are poor have not succeeded for whatever reason. And we're going to even throw it more in their face by telling you, we're going to embarrass you. The way I look at it is our clinic, we're in Overtown. And for those of you that don't know where Overtown is, you can catch us every January during the riots on CNN in Miami. And if you look at this, I'm thinking, well, sure, I'm not poor, but I'm going to walk right in here. But then, why do we have to ask that question? Why do we have to make people prove their poverty to offer them a service that is essential that I'm trained to give? So, and then the other question is, of course you got to do that. because they rip off the welfare system. Well, I'm glad to know that no doctor's ever ripped off the IRS. So somewhere along the line, we get this wonderful attitude where we can judge and throw these rules down on other people because we have this issue that we know about. But it's okay for us to rip off the IRS because that's expected. This is America. So you have to turn around. We have to learn from when we go out there. You have to follow what Mark Twain said. Never let your schooling interfere with your education. When you get out there, what you learn on the streets, what you learn from out there is something that can't be taught in books. You're learning human nature, you're learning lives, you're learning cultures, you're learning things that we don't know about. Even if you grew up in poverty in 1960, it's 1993. And there wasn't crack back then, and there weren't gangs back then, and the issues that are occurring today are different than the issues that are going to occur in the year 2003. So we have to be flexible enough to be able to deal with those issues. Because if not, we're going to be failing in what we're trained to do, which is to take care of our society. And if everybody makes the proper policy choices, then we can make the greatest comment in our society. Because the saddest commentary in our society right now is the fact that Jim O'Connell and myself have successful homeless clinics. What a horrible commentary. I'm here because I'm dealing with a major social problem in my country. There's something wrong with that. The greatest commentary that could be made is you make these clinics obsolete. Because this issue of homelessness can be dealt with in a way that is not as massive as it is, because homelessness will always exist. And let's not fall into the same trap we did with the Let's Make America Drug-Free, as up in Washington they're deciding drug policy over cocktails. But we're going to make America drug-free. So we have to be very careful and look at it as what is the best way to deliver least harm to our society. From my perspective, is what is the best way to make sure people don't end up as sick as they do, so that we can have a better chance of treating them and offering people the better life that they're allowed to have in this country. So if we take the attitude that when we go out, we still have a lot to learn. We might have the academic background. We have a lot to learn. You gather from your experiences, but realize that poverty, like the rest of America, changes. My parents, when they left Cuba the second time, 1959, 1960, are frozen that Cuba is 1960. Just like the Italian immigrants in the 1920s, Italy hasn't changed from the 1920s. But even if there was no communism in Cuba, it'd still be 1993. And even if we were poor growing up in the 60s, it's 1993. Things change, people change, issues change, opportunities change. And that's where you have to turn around in your policies and make those decisions. Our clinic is made under the philosophy of we want to learn what is the philosophy of poverty. I'm middle class, that's where I came from. I had no idea what it was like not to be able to get to a doctor, to go to a pharmacy, or the fact that I couldn't read the material the doctor gave me. Or if I gave you an American Diabetic Association diet or a low-fat, high-fiber diet, and you walked into your little supermarket or store in your neighborhood, none of the foods are labeled. So how are you going to follow that? So all these issues and all the technology that we've acquired in science sits over here. And then we have poverty over here, and somewhere in the middle there's policy, which doesn't move. And we keep going in these directions, and we got to make them meet somehow. Because sure, should we do a liver transplant on a homeless individual that's going to be on immunocompromised medications and then let him live under a bridge? Is that fair to that individual? Or should we have offered him the vaccine earlier? Do we look at homelessness as the broader issue of poverty and deal with it in the issue of poverty so that flow of that river doesn't continue? Or do we just push the homeless issue and forget about the greater picture and continue dealing with it for the next 20 years? So that my children that are 5 and 8 years old can then take over and start doing more work with the homeless. Because we never dealt with the reality of what the issue was. I started working with the homeless because when I was an intern, I had a gentleman dying of pulmonary tuberculosis, and I couldn't find his family. And 15 years ago, I lost a sister in a car accident. And to me, the worst thing in the world is to be a patient that is sick or dying and have no family member next to you. And the reason I got involved with the homeless because I asked the question, can't I get a family member with this individual? And like many things in science, you ask a question you never answer, and it begets another question. And no matter what level you get to in policy or dealing with issues, always ask another question. Because once I found out why he had no family, it was because he was homeless. Then the next question was, why is he homeless? Well, he's homeless because he was an alcoholic that was a Korean War veteran. But wait a second, there's a woman here that's 22 years old. She wasn't even around during the Korean War. Why is she homeless? Or why is that child homeless? Or why is this gentleman from Haiti homeless now? So you ask the questions because everybody has different reasons, and they all relate to poverty, because what ends up happening is the poor get poorer, get poorer. Homelessness becomes a linear digression of poverty in this country. With the exception of things like where you have loss of major jobs or of an industry, will the middle class fall into homelessness immediately. Our clinic is open every day. Our clinic is open in the evenings because homeless work. As with Jim, and he was the one that started this, we turn around and we outreach to shelters also, because some of them can't come in. We also have one evening which is just purely for women, because in the area of town where we are at, a lot of the women are afraid to come during the day or in the evening. So we have it specially for them. We ask them what are their needs, and then we apply and turn around and do that. Our medical students, we started getting involved about 6 years ago. We made it a required course at the medical school starting 4 years ago. And the reason we did that was we take first-year medical students and they have to rotate with our social workers at the clinic. And our clinic consists of doctors, social workers, psychologists. We have an AIDS and a TB outreach team. We're, as I was telling Jim, we're like him, a Catholic shelter, so our condoms, we put holes in them, we bless them. And we hand those out. It's not true. We sit there, we offer all the services at once, because it's bad enough that that person does come in and we do capture them for that one brief moment for whatever reason they come in. Aren't we obligated then to offer all the services we can? Or do we as a doctor stand up and say, well, we're the doctors, you guys are just social workers, forget it. No, the doctors are the candy store. The gambling casinos, the social workers in the back, they're the ones that are really making the money. They're turning lives around. We're dealing with the acute problem. We're way down the river. They're the ones that are going to get them back on that bridge and home again. So if we don't work together, and if the medical student doesn't understand that, then what kind of physician can he be? And how is he expected to understand that when we charge $20,000 a year tuition? So I'm telling you, the medical students we get are not coming from under the bridge. So it becomes our responsibility as educators then to teach them in a practical manner, and also to teach them that just because Harrison's textbook of medicine says this is how you treat the patient, try it. Or when the crack addict that came in one night sat there and the medical student came up and said, well, you know, all he wants is vitamins. It's 8 o'clock at night, it's Overtown. Nobody walks in just for vitamins. He says his affect was very flat, and the bottom line was he was coming off his crack. And the medical student says, well, should I tell him that it's bad for him? I think that's a good idea, try it. So, see what kind of response you get here. Well, I learned in class that we had that obligation to explain to our patients that substances were bad. Well, try it. See what you can learn. The bottom line was the patient came in asking for help, and he didn't know how to come out and say it. But the student isn't going to learn if I sit in the lecture hall and say that. The student's going to learn when he can apply it, and he could sit there and see it firsthand. So the students, what I hope they learn as they rotate through our clinics are not that they have to treat the poor, but that we're healthcare providers. And we have to treat everybody, and everybody's different, and thus our therapeutic applications have to adapt to the lifestyle of the individuals we treat, and there's nothing that is cookbook about it. Our medical students started an organization about 6-7 years ago called the Camila's Heads. Camila's House is the name of the shelter in the clinic. And interestingly, about a year ago, they came back to us. Now, these are students with long hair and earrings, and they said, you know, that sounds too 60s. And so they changed their name. And the name of the student group is now People Who Give a Shit, which is, it's true. It's an interesting name, but it pretty much puts it in a nutshell. And I had brought the things. Actually, the truth is, this is their motto. It's people before profits. They're handing these out at the School of Business on the other side of the river right now. But that is their motto. And the other thing that they have is they have a poster that shows a homeless woman holding a child, and it says, excuse me, can you spare some social change? So the students fully understand that what we deal with are the consequences of inappropriate or lack of policies that deal in the public and the social sector. And what we need to do is turn around and learn what the realities of this poverty is so that we could better treat our patients. Because the doctor's role is to treat the patient, or in an educational environment to teach what our observations have been. It becomes incumbent upon all of you to learn from what is out there to set the right policies in the future. This isn't going to change in 4 years. It's going to take a generation to change, because it's taken more than a generation to create the problem we have. We can either keep waiting, and Jim's clinic is going to be even more successful, and he'll open a 100-bed respite center next year, or you can deal with the problem now, cap it where it is, and then human lives won't end up suffering. The other thing that I think is so important in policy or in anything we do is always remain the student. Always keep your eyes and ears open and always listen. I'm going to finish up here and let the other two speak on, I think, what is one of the prime examples and what the bottom line of all these issues are. I came into our clinic one day around lunch, and there was a homeless mother there with her 3 kids. And you don't walk in with a sandwich into a clinic and eat it. So I gave it to the youngest child, and the child turned around, and it took 2 bites and stuck it in his pocket. And I asked him why, and he said it was for his brothers. And it was fascinating to me how a homeless, hungry child got it all right. It wasn't even a cognitive thought, it was an automatic reaction. He's thinking about the person next to him. He's thinking about somebody else. And as you deal with all these issues and you get into other things and all the egos and turf wars that go along with all the politics of life, except in medicine, because there's no politics in medicine, that remember, well, I don't know, in Miami there's no politics, Jim. There's that you can turn around and try and learn from that. Because I thought about it, I said, I have 2 fellowships, I have a doctorate, and I have a little 5-year-old child, 4-year-old child, teaching me what the essence of what we're supposed to be doing. And when you sit there and you argue with your legislators or you talk to your businessmen, bring it down to the common denominator of human life and what this country is about. And then people understand it a little better, and perhaps we can have the solutions that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Linda Johnson, who is currently the Housing Policy Coordinator for the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless. She has her BA in Political Science from UMass Boston and is a member of the Women's Statewide Legislative Network and Allowance and a member of the Coalition for Basic Human Needs. She's also a member of the Review Committee of the Fund for Self-Reliance, which hopefully you'll explain a little bit to us at the Fund for the Homeless. Lisette is also at the Fund for the Homeless. But more importantly for tonight, Linda will be talking to us not just about what she does, but about, I think, a bit about her experiences. Linda has 2 children. She's a former AFDC recipient and a formerly homeless mother. Still a mother, but no longer homeless. Linda.
Well, I wish I could come here tonight and tell you that I had some great policy solution to poverty in this country, but unfortunately, I don't. I guess I'm a little further up the river from Joe. Hopefully, we're trying to fix that bridge, albeit slowly and in little small ways. As far as policy issues here in Massachusetts, from my own experience, back in the 80s, my income had stagnated, and actually I lost income given that inflation was rising so quickly. And at that time, the housing costs in this state were skyrocketing. The rents tripled within a 2-year period, so that families became homeless at an incredible rate, especially single women with children were probably hit disproportionately to any other group. So I guess that's sort of my frame of reference because that's where I came from. In 1984, when I could no longer afford to pay my rent, I had to quit my job and go on welfare. And back then, there weren't a lot of family shelters around. In fact, the only one that was anywhere near me was 25 miles away here in the city of Boston. And terrified to bring them here to Boston, I refused to come. I was lucky enough to have family that would pass me around until I got a subsidy, which I have today. And without that subsidy today, my 2 teenagers and I would probably be paying 70% of my income just for our shelter expenses. And that's the situation for many people that I come in contact with on a daily basis. They just don't have the income it takes to provide decent housing for their families in this state. I mean, it's not just families. I have met hundreds of individuals who are also homeless, and their problems are somewhat different. There are some who have just come on hard times. They don't have a lot of education, and I've met them in the shelters here in Boston. They don't have high school degrees. They did menial labor. They're older now. They've lost their job, and no one will hire them. They're older. Some of them have slight health problems, but nothing that should prohibit them from working. But there's so many other people that are younger that can do the job and maybe for less pay, that they really can't find a job. And there are those who have substance abuse problems, have mental illness, and you know, the state has, in my opinion, turned its back on those people. The legislature got rid of the general relief program, which left, it cut close to 20,000 people who had some disabilities, who are over age 45 and couldn't find a job. All those folks are in the shelters now, totally hopeless. There's no way out for them. No one will hire somebody who's a little bit crazy. But yet the state doesn't find that they're disabled enough to be entitled to any benefits. So they're stuck in the shelters. So I guess what I need to talk about tonight is the little tiny things that my organization can do to try to put something back for some of these folks. For the individuals, I mean, we have fought this general relief cut since it happened. When it first happened, I was working at the Mass Law Reform Institute, and I had the opportunity to work really hard to try to salvage what was left of the new program. And the director where I work now spends most of her days trying to put that program back together again. I work mainly with families now. I spend my time going around to different family shelters, talking with families, encouraging them to get active, because they are the ones who are never heard. People assume that they're homeless because they didn't manage their money correctly, because they were stupid, they're lazy, they're on welfare, they won't do anything to help themselves. When the majority of those women, and the majority are in fact women, most of them have at least 2 children, if not more, have a lot of aspirations. They want to do lots of things, but their AFDC grants right now are 40 to 50% below poverty. The average grant or the actual grant for a family of 3 with 2 children in unsubsidized housing is $579 a month. You can't even find a 1-bedroom apartment on that kind of an income. And that woman can't possibly go back to work and afford daycare when the average cost to put an infant in daycare in this state is $120 a week. You know, I mean, the economics of it, to me, are so simple and so clear, and I don't understand how people can't understand the simplicity of it. So we at the Coalition have filed a couple of bills to try to at least help AFDC families stay out of shelter. It's a bill that we filed with the legislature this year to try to get the AFDC grant increased. Everybody who lives in unsubsidized housing in the state gets a $40 a month rental allowance. Obviously, $40 is totally inadequate. So what we have proposed is everyone who, excuse me, who pays at least 50% of their income for rent, which almost every AFDC recipient pays 90% of their income for rent, if not more, would get the $40 rental allowance. And then for every dollar above 50% they pay, they could get another dollar of a rental allowance. So they could possibly get $150 a month towards their rent rather than $40 a month. It's not going to help tremendously, but it's possible that with another $150 a month, the mom with 2 kids might be able to find a 1-bedroom apartment and avoid having to go into shelter. The legislature has been adamant about refusing to increase that AFDC grant. It has not been increased since 1988, and they absolutely refuse to raise it at all. So hopefully we can convince them that it's cheaper to give someone $150 a month than it is to pay a shelter $2,700 a month for a bed. And that's what it costs to house a family in a shelter in this state. Massachusetts seems to have addressed the issue of homeless families by opening shelters everywhere. There are currently 170 shelters in the state of Massachusetts. Not all of them are family shelters. Probably about 120, maybe 150 are family shelters. And it literally costs the state between $2,000 and $2,700 per month per family in these shelters. The state used to have a program called the 707 program. It was a state rental assistance program that would provide families with a certificate that allowed them to only have to pay 30% of their income for rent. In its infinite wisdom, it has trashed that program. It's gone. So rather than pay a small amount of money for a rent subsidy for these families, the state has chosen to pay probably 5 or 6 times more to house families in shelters. So we have tried very hard, once again, to convince the state that it's cheaper, more effective, it's better for the families, they stay healthier, both mentally and physically if they have their own places. So what we have proposed is another bill that we filed this year called the Transitional Rental Allowance. And that would say that any family who's been in shelter for 90 days or more would be eligible for a flat subsidy of up to $500 a month to live in their own apartment until they can get a Section 8 certificate or get into some kind of a public housing program. They would be able to keep that subsidy of up to $500 a month for up to 2 years. Most people who have a homeless preference, everybody there for these Section 8 programs and for some of the other public housing programs, there's preferences. There are federal preferences. And these days, people assume that only homeless people are getting Section 8 certificate. It's not true. Less than half of the Section 8 certificates that get turned over in this state today go to those 950 families that are stuck in shelters, hotels, and motels. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But in any case, if you can get it, we figure if we can get families into their own apartments as soon as possible, give them the small subsidy that they need, and allow them to have that federal preference so that they can get a more permanent type subsidy, the family can stabilize much quicker. So we filed those 2 bills to try to more directly help families who are homeless. Another bill that we filed to try and help individuals is an SRO bill. It's for single room occupancy. I myself don't know a great deal about this bill. It is not one that I work on that much. Simply, it asks that there be a lot of restrictions around landlords deciding to change over from a single room occupancy to apartments or condos or however they want to convert them. It's an effort to try to protect the amount of single room units that are available. Many single individuals can afford to pay the small rent on a single room where they wouldn't be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So that's another bill the coalition has worked on for, I think it's been filed 4 or 5 years in a row to try to put some kind of restriction on on getting rid of these SROs. So the other final thing that I just wanted to say about how the issue of how the Section 8 certificates don't get given over to the people that need them the most in this state anymore. We have 240 housing agencies in this state. Each town usually has their own. There's some nonprofits. And they get, even though they get money from the state, they get money from the federal government, they act as gatekeepers. And they take that money and they say, we want it for our community. And they use that, we think, to keep certain groups of people out of their communities. When Shelters from Roxbury call a shelter in the suburban, call a town, a housing authority in a suburban area and say, can we apply for housing? And they hear it's from the city, they automatically say, oops, sorry, the list is closed. Or you can't come, you have to come and apply. There are lots of barriers in the current system for applying for housing in this state. Those 240 housing authorities are all allowed to have their own separate application for the same Section 8 program that they get federal money for. So a homeless individual in a shelter potentially has to fill out 240 separate applications for the same damn program. And then, One housing authority says, fine, I'll mail it to you, you can mail it back. The next one says, sorry, come and pick it up, and then you can mail it back. Or another one will say, I'll mail it, but you gotta bring it in person. There's even one that insists on doing an eyeball exam of you first before they'll even give you an application. But they won't give it to you that day. You have to come out, say hello, they look at you, and then they tell you to go away and they'll send you an application. It's absolutely crazy, and it has really, it's part of the reason why less than half of the Section 8 certificates in this state have gone to people who are in homeless shelters. So we're also working very hard to try to get the Executive Office of Communities and Development and HUD to look at this mess and try to, I mean, EOCD currently has the regulatory authority to do something about this, but it chooses not to because the housing authorities really don't like outside interference. They like to do things their own way. They see this as their money. They see it as a way to serve their citizens. And people who live outside of their community aren't their citizens. And I guess the best story I heard was from this man who is a housing search worker in a shelter here in Boston, went to meet with Barney Frank recently. Because Barney Frank supported initially the notion that said that local housing authorities could keep those certificates in their communities and not allow other people from the outside to have them. So this man said to him, he said, gee, isn't that interesting that you feel like those certificates should belong in just this community and no place else? He said, you know, well, I grew up here, so I feel like maybe this community owes me something because when I got called to go fight in the Korean War, no one told me I was going to fight just for this town. He said, hell, if they had told me that, I would have dug a foxhole in my front yard and I would have stayed right there. So, and, you know, interestingly enough, I got a call from Representative Frank's office today, and they really want to work with us and to help us meet with HUD and maybe try to change some of this stuff. So I was really happy that, you know, we at least saw some gleam of light that might help some homeless families get better access to some of those subsidies. Because for some people, the answer isn't housing exclusively. Yes, they need housing, but they may need a myriad of other types of services. But for the majority of homeless families that are female-headed, they need an affordable place to raise their children. And once they get that, then they can make the decisions about job training, education, and trying to do other things. I did the same thing, but I couldn't do those things unless I had a place of my own. And when I did, I went back to school and I got my degree, and you know, I now work full-time and I'm still low income, you know. So, I mean, this notion that if you get job training and you get education and you get out there and get a job, it's going to solve all of your problems is really not the entire story. Yes, people need to try to better themselves, but we can't cram it down their throats and make them do it and make all kinds of judgments about them because they're not ready to do it. Being a single parent and trying to raise your kids in the society the way it is today is a very hard job. It's very hard to leave your kids alone all afternoon long and sit at work and wonder, what the hell are they doing? You know, I mean, you can't be two places at once. And if society wants us to raise responsible children that are good citizens and will grow up to be taxpayers instead of a burden on the system, then they need to give us the tools that we need to raise them that way. So I've made a commitment to spend my life trying to help convince the people that have the power to make the changes to do so that we can raise our children in dignity and not in poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Our third speaker is Lizette Rodriguez, who is currently working with the Boston Foundation as the Associate Director of the Fund for the Homeless. And the fund is a special project of the Boston Foundation that addresses issues of homelessness and related problems. In the past, Lizette has directed a shelter, worked for a community development corporation. And I'd just like to say a personal word as someone who's worked with Lizette off and on for the last 3 years, maybe, or a couple years. Lizette has pushed a lot of us in the social policy area to think very differently about issues of homelessness. As you know, many of us work with what has now become is now being termed a social deficits model, focusing on the needs of individuals and how society, how we as individuals, society as a whole, can meet these needs. Lizette has been pushing on us very hard for the last several years to turn that around and start thinking about the strengths of the homeless and the strengths of the poor and build our models and our programs around those strengths rather than around the deficits. It's a very important and very fundamental change in how we address a wide range of social problems, and it's taken many of us quite a while to get our heads turned around. Lizette now manages a special funding initiative that funds organizations led by homeless individuals and formerly homeless individuals, and she's going to talk to us about some of those issues now.
I want to thank the students who asked me to be part of the forum tonight. I think it's a really great opportunity to step back and talk about some of the issues that, unfortunately, for those of us who are involved in this work day to day, sometimes we don't get to speak about as often as we'd like. As Julie mentioned, I am going to focus basically on the importance of involving homeless people in policy making and the design of programs. And if she says that I've been pushing for kind of a new paradigm, a new model for looking at homeless people differently and at poor people in general, it's because I have been pushed by those people to see them differently. It's not because I became enlightened all of a sudden one day. It's because I was forced and told to be quiet at several meetings because I didn't know what I was talking about. And that really forced me to look at myself, my own assumptions, and my own experience from a perspective that I think was very different than I would have done otherwise. The Fund for the Homeless has a special initiative called the Fund for Self-Reliance, which is what Linda had mentioned earlier. And the Fund for Self-Reliance really grew out of homeless people telling us, we need to set up our own organizations, we want to set up our own programs, we want to take a place at the table where decisions about our lives are being made. But right now we can't do it, we don't have the skills, we haven't been asked to do so, we don't have the credibility. We're kind of low people on the totem pole here, and we need the backing of some kind of institution that has some push to do that. And in addition to that, we need funding, so please set up this initiative so we can get our organizations going. And that's what we did. We have created a funding program that really targets specifically those organizations that are 50% at least of homeless and formerly homeless people, and we have funded nearly 10 organizations in less than a year. And that's a really new trend in the area, in the city of Boston and in this area, because we have a very strong advocacy and service provider system, which is excellent. It really saves people's lives, and it really advocates for people's rights, but doesn't necessarily include homeless people in everyday decision making. So all of us are learning a lot. We're feeling some of the friction that's involved in that kind of work. We're being called on a lot of things, and I think it's really exciting, the results of some of that work, and which I'll share with you. But before I do that, I really want to talk a little bit about the philosophy behind why we took this approach, besides being somewhat forced to do that. I think part of it is really just over time, a lot of us who've been involved in this field really thinking about how many programs were created that didn't really address the needs that homeless people were talking about. You know, in this time when everybody talks about fiscal constraints, and people are constantly refer to the fact that we don't have money to set up the programs that we would want to, that it would be ideal if we had a different kind of system, but we have to target those who are most needy, or we have to really create programs that address this particular need and are not comprehensive. We had been hearing from people, you can set up those programs and you can do whatever they want, they're not really going to address these issues. For example, the people from the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, which is in New York City and really has a very comprehensive program around homelessness, were talking to us about New York City, which made a serious commitment to housing homeless families over the last 5 years. They have spent millions and millions of dollars rehabbing housing, getting people out of hotels. Many of you probably know about the terrible stories that you hear about homeless families staying in hotels in New York, the city paying outrageous amounts of money for that temporary shelter and really not getting the kind of treatment and the kind of dignity that those families deserve. So the city really makes a commitment to house homeless families, to put them in new apartments, some of them in different parts of the city. Many of the apartments, which I learned later, when we first heard about this initiative, of course, we were all very excited. We're like, Boston or Massachusetts should do the same thing, make a serious commitment. It's a city that's really strapped for funds. They're always bankrupt or practically bankrupt, but they're making this commitment of all these millions of dollars. Why can't we do the same? When I heard about the details of the project, I got kind of horrified, because what has happened is that they have, for example, a few stories that I heard about is they had gone into an apartment building where poor people had lived for many years and were paying, very low rent, but which was really in bad shape. They rehabbed one apartment out of that whole building. They moved a homeless family in, creating incredible tension between the poor families who had been living there forever and the new homeless family whom they saw as an intruder and as getting access to resources that they never had access to themselves. In addition to that, the neighborhood as a whole had no health services, the schools were in really bad shape, families were going back to their old neighborhoods to do their shopping because they didn't have any kind of connection to their new neighborhood, and there were no shopping facilities nearby. So you're talking about taking someone who's been through this terrible experience and putting them in this apartment where they're isolated because their neighbors all of a sudden don't like them. And in addition to that, they don't have access to the services that they need. So what happens then after this is done over and over? The city of New York turns around and says, you see, it isn't just housing. These families need so much more. We can't create a program to solve these problems. So that the public policy system then turns around and blames families for their inability to cope with such a situation. And more we were seeing that a lot of what was being called failure of people to be able to adapt to the programs was the fact that the programs weren't created with people's input to begin with. And we really felt like we didn't want to make that mistake with our own funding options, and that we had to really work with advocacy and service providers organizations to push them to really think about what they were doing in a new light. Secondly, I think it's really important to stress that this model really assumes that homeless people have something to contribute. I think that a lot of the time, because homelessness, as Dr. Greer mentioned, is such a visible problem, you see people who don't have the ability to be dysfunctional in private like the rest of us, be in private, be dysfunctional sometimes in public, who don't have a place to kind of work out their own issues or to deal with their personal lives, do it in public. And I think it's very distressing. We make assumptions about what they are and what they're not capable of doing. And I think that has been really the biggest lesson for me, because again, we do judge people's appearance, the way that people act, and we just assume that they aren't capable of higher thought, different kind of intellectual activity or participation at a level that to my surprise, and I always considered myself someone who would give people a chance until proven otherwise, I just learned a lot about about seeing people and just waiting to see what they could do. Because many times I just really have seen that what you see is very different from what people have inside of them and what people are able to give. And this really gets back to, we've been hearing a lot with the new administration around the themes of responsibility and the themes about caring for people but making sure that they live up to their side of the contract. And even if it comes from that perspective, I think it's a really critical point of view, which is why sometimes you saw many homeless people during the last 2 elections wearing push buttons. And you asked yourself, well, how is that possible? I mean, policies of that administration have caused so much homelessness. They've created chaos in the lives of many of these people. But the fact was that the Republicans and the conservatives in this country have a language around self-help and responsibility that really resonated with homeless people. They saw as, at least, even from the Republican side, that those people saw them even as more capable and more interested in pushing them to be responsible for themselves than the liberals and the Democrats. And I think it's a lesson for all of us to really understand that people do want to take responsibility for their lives. People do want to do things for themselves, but often we set up programs and policies that don't allow that to happen. Finally, I think the important thing that I have learned is that people have this need to reclaim their place as American citizens. People have a need to become participants in a democracy. People want to stop being labeled and seen exclusively as homeless people or poor people or people in need of health services. They want to be seen as American citizens first who have this need to access this particular service at this time for whatever reason. And that, to me, has been the most compelling thing, the fact that sometimes people are thinking about democracy in ways that we don't ordinarily think about, that we think about going once every 4 years or whenever there's an election to pull a lever, and that's our concept of democracy, but that we don't think of participating in the legislative process at the policy-making level the way that many people who've been affected by those systems do. And that they have a vested interest in participating at that level because obviously they have been directly impacted, and many times in a negative way, by those decisions that have been made by other people who don't know anything about their lives. So the need for people to reclaim their place as American citizens, to no longer feel disenfranchised from the mainstream, to feel like, in spite of their problems, they are still worthy of support and assistance just because they happen to be born in this country and because they are part of this fabric of society, even though there may not be people that we would ordinarily like to claim as our own, has been a really important issue that people have brought up to us. I think the important thing that kind of encloses everything is the understanding, after you go through this process directly with people, is that you don't have the whole truth. You know, you may have a master's degree, you may have done a lot of program work, you may have developed or run organizations, but you have not felt in the way that those people have felt as they're going through the crisis. And in this way, I think I remember a lot of Paulo Freire's teachings in terms of, you know, the teacher not having the whole truth, but rather the importance of being in dialogue between the student and the teacher, and that together they discover a new truth and kind of reach a higher plateau. And I think it really applies in this instance, in that, you know, maybe homeless people don't have all the sophisticated lingo that you need to put legislative programs together or put public policy together or develop programs, but they have an understanding of this issue that many of us who have not lived through it don't have. And together, I think the force that can be created for good and for social change can be really powerful. The fact that Linda is the housing person at the Mass Coalition for the Homeless gives me an incredible sense of reassurance that a lot of the housing policies that that organization is going to try to achieve are going to be directly related to someone's experience of having been homeless. And I think that that is a really important point to remember, because many of us, because we have good intentions, because we have been around homeless people, because we have really seen them not from the point of view of pity, but we have really seen them as people who we want to help and we are willing to help, really think we have this higher truth, and we don't have it. And when I think about this, I often, you know, I appreciate that Dr. Greer is so enlightened, but not all of his colleagues are. And I just remember when I'm in a doctor's office, it's always the most empowering experience for me. When I'm sick and I'm vulnerable and I'm with a doctor that doesn't want to tell me anything about what's going on. It's the worst thing. You go in, they take your blood pressure and they don't tell you what it is. They take your temperature and they don't tell you what it is. They figure you don't really need to know that after a half an hour of tests, they'll tell you, you're fine, go home, you have a virus, take some Tylenol. And I always remember what that feels like to me, because I have a really hard time challenging that system and challenging a professional that I think is an expert to tell me more about my life, to tell me more about how I am, that even though I don't know what kind of treatment I should get, but I know how I feel, and I want to be a participant in the decision around that. So to me, that's something that always reminds me of how a lot of homeless people feel when they do come forward and feel vulnerable around needing something, and then feel like service providers, advocates, and many of us who are really interested in helping are the experts and that they don't have the right to challenge that. And I really think we need to put ourselves in a position where we are made more vulnerable and we understand that we don't have all the answers and that together we can accomplish something of a higher order. Now, the reality of doing this is that it's very hard. I don't want by any means to say, oh, involve homeless people and everything will be fine. It's a very, very difficult thing to do because people have never been invited to the table to participate in this way. They feel uncomfortable. They feel like they don't have the expertise. They feel like you're using them as tokens many times, and you have to really work with people to get them to the level where they feel like they are capable of participating in a way that's really meaningful. People don't always think that you have the best intentions in mind when you do this. They sometimes think that you're trying to co-opt them into doing something that they wouldn't ordinarily do unless you involve them. So your intentions are going to be called into question. Finally, you have to be prepared for some of the anger that's going to lash out of people once they are finally given the chance to say, this is what it's like for me. This is what it's been like for me, and this is what your programs and your policies have done. And you might be identified with a system that you've never really wanted to be a part of. And you have to be prepared for when that anger lashes out. But once I think you go through that process, I think what you will find is the opportunity to really renovate your thinking, to really begin to implement some things that you never thought would be possible. What I have found is that many times people who have not been directly affected by the problem are willing to go for smaller gains, legislatively or in terms of program. Well, we can't get this program passed, so let's go, one step below that. And people who've suffered it go, look, we have nothing to lose. Why would you go for something below that? Let's go for the real thing, and then if it takes longer, we'll work on it longer, and we'll just get what we really need, something that will really address our needs, and not some kind of menial program that's going to help us in the short term, but is not really going to change our living situation. So I think, again, it's a possibility of uniting the expertise that you have as somebody who's been involved with this field and the experiences, powerful experiences of somebody who's been through it together to really create something that I think will be highly valuable to all of us and that will challenge us to really think about social change in a way that does not come from exclusively from people who are professionals and experts, but that really speaks to the truth of the people who've experienced those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisette. Before we move on to questions, I'd just like to ask Jim O'Connell if you'd like to come down and say anything about health care for the homeless in Boston. Sure, come on down. Come on down. You can answer. Are you the director?
Jim has never been to the state of Florida, and I don't want to make that public statement, okay?
Jim is the director of the health care for the homeless. I met Jim when we were on a committee to develop some guidelines for doing research on the homeless in shelters. This is a very vulnerable population, and often researchers come in with more of a voyeuristic intention than an actual policy intention, and often not very smart about doing it. So we seem to have effectively discouraged everybody, right? We haven't met in a long time. We sort of pass judgment on every research proposal.
Actually, I would just say it's been a treat listening to the panel who as you all learn, and I've been doing this for a long time now, each time I hear from another perspective, there's something that I realize we really do completely wrong, and then I have to go back and rethink what we've been up to. Just for information, and it's a treat. I met Joe, actually, I can tell you, it was in 1985 or 86, the first time we ran into, and I've known Lizette since at least that time when you were running the shelter in Jamaica Plain. And Linda, I don't know, I've heard about you, but I've never met you before. So, in Boston, actually, we have a program similar to what Joe has. And part of it runs also in Cambridge. It's called the Health Care for the Homeless program. We tried once to change our name to something that didn't have the word homeless in it, and no one could find us, so we had to change our name back to Health Care for the Homeless. It was very discouraging. But we basically run clinics every day at Mass General Hospital and Boston City Hospital, and then the same providers, we work as teams of doctors with nurse practitioners and social workers or caseworkers. And we provide, those same teams provide care in about 42 different sites around town, including all the motels, and Linda would know this well. You probably know Boston Families. There's no motel or hotel in Boston that will take families when the family shelters are full. So there's approximately, I think last week we had about 180 Boston families who were sent down to motels and hotels from Hull on the South Shore all the way up to Peabody on the North Shore. So if you think it was a dilemma just living in a shelter, you'd imagine taking your 3 kids and being in a motel room and having to take about 4 buses and 1 train to get back to the welfare office or to your healthcare provider. So we actually send our teams out there. It's extraordinarily cost ineffective, but I think something that we probably have to do. The lesson that I would just share, and the thing that I am really become staggered by in my time, and I think this panel is really showing it to you, is that for some reason in our world, and I'm as guilty as this as anything, we get trained in medical school and learn medicine, and we learn Harrison's principles of medicine. I'm sure in schools of social work you learn this, and in schools of business you learn those things. And when you look around, it turns out that money is given that way too. Money is given sort of categorically in very vertical ways. So when you are trying to figure out how to be one service among 15 that people should have a choice of choosing, you realize that each one of us is funded by a different site and have all these restrictions on what we can do, when in fact, someone should be able to make their decisions that they need housing, they need WIC, they need some better help with education, they need some health care, and they need this, and all of that money should just be right there. It should be up to people to choose that stuff. The way we've worked it in this country, and I can't quite figure out why, is everything goes like this instead of like this. So if there was a policy thing that I would really urge you to try to figure out is how do we break down that damn categorical funding? I love working as a doctor, but Joe said it so well. We're out there on the fringe serving, all we're doing is trying to get people in to see the social workers who really do the real work in our program, and the nurses who actually do all the real trust work, which is the 2 key things. But the funding for social workers comes from a whole other world than the funding from doctors. So we can't get it, it's really hard. We have to figure out how to do that. The other thing that I would point out is that there is also it's a very tough world to work in for all the reasons that you heard tonight. It's hard to get homeless people to be involved in things like healthcare because most of them are the same way all of us are. No one wants to work with a doctor. They're impossible to work with. We don't have many formerly homeless doctors. It's sort of like I want in the legislature to have a few people on methadone clinics so that at least they'd have a fair shake as to what's going on, but we don't have many of them. So how to get people involved is the kind of exciting stuff I think that Lizette in that program is trying to help us with. The other things we have a lot of trouble with is finding minority physicians, nurses, and social workers to work in our programs. I don't know what the reason. We've tried really hard. We've done very well at the level up as social worker, but we've had a real hard time finding nurses and doctors willing to work in our program. I don't know what the things we can do to help with that. But anyway, those are just a few thoughts I would say. I would welcome, if any of you are in town, if you ever want to come over and see any of our programs, you're most welcome to do it. Our main office is down right at Boston City Hospital, just as a healthcare for the homeless. It's right on the street, 729 Mass Ave. And you'd be welcome to come and see any of the programs. And I've never been in the state of Florida, but all my friends say if you really want a trip, you know where to go. Thank you.
Why don't you just stay here, because you might want to answer some of it. I should also just put in a little plug that both Jim and Lizette have been very active in sponsoring PAEs among students. So those of you who might be looking for a PAE topic, here are 2 good clients. We're now opening it for questions. The traditional pattern is that you go to the microphone either on the right or the left. You start by identifying yourself and then asking your question. So if people have questions, if you want to line up.
Will the microphone they go to sort of tell us which party affiliation they're with?
No, I think it'll tell us how much common sense they have in getting out of the role. Okay, Alma.
Alma Ayala, I'm a second-year MPA student. Lisette, could you talk a little bit about the kinds of programs you have funded over the past year?
Sure. As I said, this is really there are other parts of the country where these kinds of programs have really taken off. In this area, they're fairly new. I think the oldest successful program, because there are a lot of attempts that don't, make it, unfortunately sometimes, is maybe 3 or 4 years old. So we're talking very, very new, very small, very grassroots organizations. You probably have seen the Spare Change newspaper, people selling that out on the street. That's one of the organizations we support. Spare Change is a newspaper sold and published and written by homeless people. Another organization, actually a lot of the organizations that we fund are in Cambridge, which I think is interesting, but not surprising. We fund an organization that runs a drop-in center for homeless people where people can do basic things like take a shower, have a locker where they can leave their clothes, cook themselves a meal. I mean, these little things. A lot of homeless people are always served meals. They don't have a place to cook for themselves. So if they wanted one day to eat something that was different from what was offered at a soup kitchen or at a shelter, they don't have the ability to do that. So a place to cook, a place to take a shower, a place to receive phone calls where nobody's gonna say so-and-so program, but people just answer hello. And you don't have to tell people that you're homeless, and you can get phone calls for job interviews. And a place where you can use a computer and a typewriter if you wanna, look for jobs, you wanna write a letter or whatever. And we find that a lot of the programs that we fund offer some basic service because that's a way to kind of get people involved and hook them in. And then when people are involved, they're also doing some kind of political organizing or doing some other work around policy issues, and both of those organizations are doing that. The Drop-In Center is a place where people meet and congregate and talk about not just about where they're gonna get their next meal, but how would you like to be involved in this particular campaign? The same thing with Spare Change. We're funding an organization of women, formerly homeless mothers, it's out in Framingham, that was basically a group of people who got together and who said, God, we've been through so much, and why don't we talk about our experiences and reflect on that together? And they got someone, the organization that sponsored them, got someone to design this empowerment curriculum, and they basically went through this 12-week course where they reflected on their experiences together, which is a very different process than reflecting on your experience by yourself. And they discovered all these common issues that they had and all these things that they had gone through together. And they decided, we have a lot to contribute. If I had known, one woman said, if I had known that I was able to use a certain service from the Department of Public Welfare, this benefit that allowed me to store my furniture while I was homeless, I wouldn't have had to put all my furniture out on the street, lose it, and then start all over again when I moved into my own apartment. So these women decided that they wanted to go into shelters to tell other women about their rights and benefits, and that they wanted to be a support to those women and say, you can make it, I've been through it. And also that they wanted to do public education around homelessness because they're out in the suburbs, and their problem is that people in the suburbs don't think that homelessness is a problem out there. So they've been in a lot of public parades and public activities where they get to say, we are a group of formerly homeless mothers, and we want to reach out to other people who are in need. If you need us, call us, we're here to serve you. So that's just kind of an example of the range of programs that we funded. If you want to talk to me afterwards more specifically, then I'm willing to do that. I do want to mention that there's a student in this audience, Rosemary Day, who's sitting back there.
Former student.
That's right, a graduate of the Kennedy School, who did a PAE for the Fund for the Homeless, where she asked the question sort of, should homeless people participate in the creation of programs, and how does that happen? What's the vehicle for doing that? And you can talk to her, or you can talk to me about what the study revealed, which was that it's very hard. There are no clear-cut answers to doing that. As Jim said, some programs manage it better than others. And some people are more interested in doing that than others. So, it's a difficult field. There are no fast and ready answers. But if you want to know a little bit more about that, or if you want to see a copy of the report, we'll be happy to. You can see me afterwards, or you can talk to Rosemary. She did a great job, by the way.
She won the Carballo Award.
When you talk about the homeless and lump everyone together, it seems to me it becomes kind of difficult. I've worked with a variety of different poor groups in the Massachusetts and New England, and recently I've worked on the state deinstitutionalization plan, trying to help chronic mentally ill people move into the community. And those issues of the chronic mentally ill have become so intractable and difficult when you start lumping them into the whole homeless area as far as jobs and training and what actually can be done. And I was wondering what type of experiences you might have in Florida on that. And I'd like to make a few other quick comments. First of all, on the question of self-help, I cannot let that go by as far as responsibility, because people who've worked in the 60s and 70s, it was never an either-or issue. All of us, many of us felt that self-help was important, but we felt the programs, we were committed to the programs. It was not the situation of saying that people could do things on their own. We felt that they could, but some people were in such desperate situations that the services had to be provided as best they could. And my other comment is that regarding categorical area situations and a universal, how do we get these situations horizontal instead and vertical? Well, Clinton proposed the expansion of a Head Start and WIC program, for example. Now, instead of just expanding Head Start, and where there's a lot of criticism in the Head Start program by some of the people who started it, Professor Ziegler at Yale has stated unequivocally that there's a lot of problems in the quality of the programs and a great amount of difficulty in any standardization. A lot of people feel that the Head Start program has to be looked at first to see where the quality is, and then looking at how it can be expanded into looking at different parental programs and looking at different options. And similarly, the WIC program, instead of expanding it when there's a lot of bureaucracy there, looking at it as far as a universal maternal and child health program and becoming more of a comprehensive system and a package instead of having these categorical programs. I feel that's disappointing. That's it.
First of all, Florida ranks, well, I was arguing with Frank, I thought we were 50th, he claims we're 49th in social services, and I've been to Mississippi and they're better. So as far as how we deal with those issues, with all due candor, in South Florida, we have only one small clinic to deal with the mentally ill that are homeless. And that issue is not an issue that's even addressed in our state, even though we elected a governor who openly admitted he was depressed and was on Prozac. But then again, he was running against Bob Martinez. So or Bob Martinez, if you're from the north part of the state. That issue is a difficult issue for us to deal with. What we see in Miami, as opposed to here, our predominant homeless population are adult males. And of those, they carry about 80 to 90% either have a single diagnosis of substance abuse or a dual diagnosis of about 50% of that population. So that's a very difficult problem to deal with, which is also reflective of our inner city. Cocaine is a drug of choice in Miami. So we also have about a 2-month wait for an individual that goes through detox to get into a treatment program, which is I always thought was a great deal, going for 3 days, wait, here's a library card, and come back. So it's fascinating to me coming up here to Cambridge and listening to the different programs and how you deal with it with the legislator, that you have 170 shelters funded by your state. We have 0. Our health program for the homeless, which last year saw 32,000 patient visits, has never received a penny from our city or our county or our state. We have to look outside for all our funding. So that's when I say, when you set policies and you look at these different issues, every single region, every single state is going to be different, as are the problems that exist there and your funding sources. So we hustle a lot. We get a lot of donations. I think we offer top quality care, and we adapt to the different things. We have the mental health issue, and particularly with the homeless, or even with anybody in our community, is not addressed at all. And if you think you have a problem up here in Massachusetts, feel free to come on down, and we'll make you guys feel real, real good. You know, if you're ever real depressed and things are going bad, come look at poverty in Florida. So that's one of the things you look at it. As you were talking about, I thought Jim was describing it perfectly. The way we deal with that issue is we always make the person go to where the dollar is. We have to start in this country having the dollar follow the patient to where the services are. And then that way, maybe you can group things together and start looking at it that way. There was only one thing that Lisette and you had brought up, and you guys kept talking about American citizens. I live in a community that has a lot of people that are not American citizens, but they live within my community. And we have to deal with that issue too. And as many of my parents, when they first came to this country, they were not citizens at that time either. So when we look at it, I prefer to say just people within our borders. and deal with those issues, because those are the people that we live with. And I can't help but think, especially up here near Plymouth Rock and all that, you know, as the boats were coming in, that one Indian had to look at the other and just sort of say, "Oh shit, boat people," because that we have to. It's difficult for me as a first generation to say, "Yeah, you're right. We got to stop it. I'm in." So that's what this country's based on. So when you deal with these issues, don't limit it so much to citizens. There's a lot of people within our borders that are not citizens, that do a lot of work. A lot of them have worked for attorney general candidates, but there are a lot of people here. But the mental health issue, unfortunately, we don't deal with well in Florida. That was, sorry.
Andres?
My name is Andres Acevedo. I'm a second-year master's student here. And I had a question for kind of the entire panel. Having had a chance to work on a needs assessment of children living in shelters in California, one thing, population that we found that wasn't being served were male teenagers. At about 14, the shelters will not accept males. And the other population we saw that really wasn't being served well, even though it's a minority population, was homeless fathers with children. And I'd like to ask if you can just give us a brief idea of some of the programs, if these communities are being served, and what kind of programs you've seen for them.
Just real briefly, we started aggressively with a family program for the mothers and the children a couple years ago. We've been very successful with what we do. We have Mark Edelstein, who is our pediatrician and runs that program. He just got his PhD in philosophy also, so nobody understands what he's saying. But that's been very good. We also found a very interesting phenomenon in our community. The society is very sensitive to women with children and will open their arms. We have never had a woman and a child come through our clinic that we don't get housed that night, whether it be in a motel and we could pay you later and things like that. Only about 10, well, that's our experiences. But with our males, we don't get that response at all. Maybe 10% get housing or get a shelter, much less housing. So there is a thought of, well, you know, my father-in-law's a World War II vet. He's a T4 paraplegic from the Aleutian Islands, who has been very successful. And his attitude is, well, look, I made it, and look what I had to go through, and look at that. My own family, my own parents say, well, look, we came from Cuba. We made it. He's healthy. Get a job. But once again, this isn't 1945, and it's not 1960. And the situations are different. So we have the predisposed ideas that because they're males, they shouldn't be where they are, that it's more their fault than anything else. Although you find that in a general sense with overall poverty, the males do tend to be picked out as well. You know, they can survive better out there, and I don't know if your experiences with that too. There's a general prejudice, in my opinion, to all poor in this country, regardless of color. It just so happens that those of color are the ones that tend to be poor. But with the adult males, and we find the same thing, those are the ones that we have the most difficulty in getting sensitivity. They also tend, many times, to be a little more aggressive in their interactions with other people. Survival on the streets is not easy, and it's you have to learn to defend yourself. Sort of like going through pre-med. We have 3 shelters for adolescents called the Bridge Projects, the Miami Bridge, and Fort Lauderdale, which is the one that receives most runaways. Because I think the adolescents would be runaway or throwaway kids, abused kids that you get there are the ones that we tend to see, but that's mostly up in the Lauderdale area. That's where kids tend to run away to, not Miami.
Yeah, here in Massachusetts, the family shelters, there are some who will not take males over the age of 12 or 14, but there are many that will. And those families that have children that age that they can't find a shelter for, the state will continue to pay for them to stay in a hotel or a motel. Also, men with children, and there are shelters that take intact families. There aren't that many, but they are scattered around the state. I mean, I think recently I've heard where there was this really bad article in the paper about how this guy had to go stay in a single shelter and his wife and kids had to go in another shelter. And we were really concerned about that because somebody had grossly misinformed that family. That whole family had a right to be sheltered, and they could have been sheltered in a shelter for families. There was no reason for them to have been pulled apart like that. So, I mean, is that what you were asking about here, or just specifically shelters for runaway teenagers?
We actually found
that's sort of part of the larger issue around welfare, you know, many times, because you get these, you know, these images of these families that are not real, which is mother and children. And many times there's a male presence. There is either a partner or the father of the children who, if he were to show up at any kind of service agency or, God forbid, the welfare office, you know, that family would lose those services. So I have seen many, you know, when I worked at the family shelter, many cases, and have know about since, where the woman will stay at the shelter with the children until she can attain a subsidy. Sometimes her partner will either stay with other people who can afford to have one more person in their house, or he'll stay at a shelter for homeless men until that situation is resolved. I mean, there are countless and countless of those situations, because unfortunately, the way that the benefit system is set up, if there's a male in the house, that family's not entitled to anything. Well, I mean, not in the strictest sense, it isn't quite that way, but the fact is that it's a lot harder for intact families to receive welfare benefits than it is for a mother with 2 children to receive them. So people just, you know, they're not willing to put up with the hassle, or they feel like they won't qualify, so they don't deal with those things.
Which, you know, from a policy perspective, I guess it's an interesting thing we throw out to society. Stay intact and we'll make it more difficult for your family to survive.
I just want to interject one question. There was an article, I think it was in the New York Times this week, saying that the most rapidly growing group of homeless in the New York State area were adolescents. Is that also happening here or in Florida?
We find the adolescents are the least one to come and seek help, and the most you have to outreach to. They're the ones that have run away from authority and everything else. So I would agree with that. They are probably after the women and the children, the least visible.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, I mean, at least in the city of Boston, there are some programs set up to help adolescents, but Boston as a city doesn't seem to have the drawing power that, for example, New York City has for a lot of young people.
Or LA.
Or LA.
LA's big with that.
So those larger cities seem to really attract younger people in a way. I mean, there is still, I think, a fairly large group here, but it seems like a lot of the service organizations, as far as I know, are able to serve a lot of them. I still think that there's a number of kids out there that aren't being reached.
You know, just for the record, in Boston, there's the Bridge Over Troubled Waters is what does all the adolescent care. And Children's Hospital works a little bit with them. But their feeling is that they want to stay out of the establishment kinds of institutions because kids then won't come. So you've probably seen the bridge van at Harvard Square comes, you know, certain, and they found that just by having a van like that is probably a better way to bring people in. We've never in Boston been able to get any kind of institutional help for adolescents. You know, the ones that have tried have not stayed. There are 3 shelters and 3 transitional programs right now for adolescent boys and girls,
Yeah.
But that's it.
There's a point here too. Jim brought up a very important perspective of how the nurses develop the trust in the health system and spending the time with the patient. Any service-oriented program that you're going to have, compassion and trust is such a vitally important aspect. You're dealing with human beings. The program is only as good as that individual delivering that initial service and gathering the trust of that person. So even though policies might work here and not there, it might come down to that issue. And bringing into that, one of the things that we do at our clinic is we hire a lot of formerly homeless individuals. In our outreach teams, they are formerly homeless. At the front desk, we have volunteers that could be homeless that are on their way out, but we let them volunteer first and do things like that. And they understand, they know a lot of the people that are coming through. They offer a lot of trust. And it's not always easy. Getting somebody to sit around that has not had our middle class discipline of getting up every morning at 8 o'clock to show up to work. Why weren't you here today? Where were you? And things like that. And those are things that have to be a lot of times retaught, and you have to be patient with that if you want to reinitiate that. But I think with the adolescents, you want to find a group that's difficult to gain trust with. I mean, just try talking with high school kids. So imagine those that have come from dysfunctional families and are out on the streets.
Hello, my name is Nelson Rainieri. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Administration student. A question, but also a brief comment. Just want to thank Dr. Greer for showing that to have Cuban blood and a social conscience is not necessarily mutually exclusive. So, happy to do that bonding. But,
it's all on tape. We're sending it to the local papers.
That's right. I'm one of 4 Cuban Democrats. We meet on a phone booth on 8th Street down there.
I'm the 5th that had to leave.
That's where you go.
My question is, and I want to thank you for challenging a lot of the assumptions, and not so much assumptions, but traditional methods of thinking. For example, in Massachusetts, I remember about 6 years ago, what happened was Governor Dukakis would tout the fact that when he first came into office, there were no homeless shelters. When he left, there were 200 plus. And most people took that as a good thing, but now what you had mentioned, really, it's not really a good thing. So when you're trying to design models, and when you're trying to design policies and programs, what do you use for measures of success? And what are some maybe current innovative models that you think might start setting the standard for the next few years? I don't know if there's any transfers across states.
Yeah, I think
to anyone,
you might
please.
want to take that one from, and then I'll.
I guess the biggest problem that I have as a formerly homeless person in dealing with the other advocates that I deal with on a daily basis is their lack of understanding of the issues, like somebody, you had said, or was said, about how people who have been there before don't want to necessarily go after the little thing that'll work. They want to go after the real solution, and they are willing to wait until the real solution happens and to fight it. But the people who are used to arguing with the politicians and lobbying the politicians and the lawyers, they are in this mindset where we have to design a program that we can get through the legislature. And I think sometimes they lose sight of why they're actually doing it. I mean, are they doing it because they want to win, or are they doing it because they want to help someone? And it's a real problem. What I think the solutions are and what they think the solutions are generally miles apart. So, I mean, right now, as far as to answer that immediate question, a program that I support to try and alleviate the problem, it's not going to get rid of the problem, but it would help get these families out of shelter into their own housing, is to use a shallow rent subsidy. The state, and some of that money it's not just all state money. A lot of it is federally reimbursable through the AFDC money. But they could use that money to provide shallow rent subsidies, if not the transitional rental allowance. I mean, any family that came into the welfare department and said, I'm homeless, instead of sticking them in a hotel until there's room in a shelter, make them sit there for 90 days, then give them a rental allowance. It's stupid. Why not give it to them when they walk in the door and they're homeless? You know, give them $500 a month towards their rent and let them stay in their own place. I mean, that's the model that I think we should be moving to. I think we should move away from institutional shelters for families and other individuals who don't have mental illness and substance abuse problems and can, I mean, for people who can live in their own housing and just need an affordable place. I think it's better for the whole family, for the kids especially, to be in their own place. So that's the model that I am looking for.
Yeah. In answering the question about benchmarks, I would put to measure whether a policy decision was correct or not. One of the things is you could look at quantity, and you could measure things. From mine is obviously disease or morbidity and mortality in a certain population. The other thing you might want to look at, which is very difficult to measure, but I know it's something that is being looked at now, is how do you measure quality of life. You might want to look at high school graduation rates. You might want to look at employment. You might want to look at incomes. There's different issues that you could look at that I have no expertise in. What I'd like to see is the poor living a little longer and living a little better. Instead of getting to the point, once again, where we let them suffer but don't let them die, why don't we just let them live and improve the quality of life? But it's very difficult to measure quantitatively quality. But there are things that you could look at with that. So, and that's how I would measure it. There's out of Yale, and I forgot his name, he does have a little book, which I looked at the cover on how to measure quality. I actually purchased it, but I haven't opened it, so I can't tell you what to set with the benchmarks, but what? Yes. You have the same book? But there are ways of measuring that, and that is being looked at right now. So whenever you set a policy, I would think you also have to ask the question, what are all the consequences down the road, and how do I measure that success? And are my indicators of success or a failure at another level of a system? So when you set these ups in communities, make sure you ask that. Ask the right question. Don't ask, how do you make healthcare cheaper? Ask, how do you make people healthier? And then perhaps you'll get to the right answer, and you'll also make it cheaper. So,
I want to throw something in real quick. This is a slightly different perspective because policy always demands one perspective, and then sort of salvation on the streets demands another one every once in a while. But we have about 65 full-time employees in our program now. You know, a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, all full-time. And success is like the critical question. You know, like, what are we doing with our lives? Is it worth it? And when we tried to, we had early on in our program had a real identity crisis, because if you get involved, if you come from a hospital like I didn't understand that Pine Street Inn was not a nice inn with a bed and breakfast type atmosphere, then when you start taking care of people, you get involved in what the homeless issue is, and you understand the diversity, the variety, and all the things we've heard tonight, then you want to get into the solution. You get really annoyed that there is not someone working on the solution to homelessness. And as soon as we started doing that, we started not doing very good service because we were so angry with everything, we couldn't do it. So we had to back off and start saying, you know, we're one little brick in the wall that's got to be built up, or the foundation that's got to be built. And so for us now, success, it'd be amazing the things that make people happy in our program now. You know, a day of sobriety, getting someone easily into a detox, getting someone who we've been caring for years with HIV to die with their own directives and their own initiative and their friends around. Those are success to us. We almost, you know, we can count on a few hands the number of times we get somebody housed through college into a functioning job and all that stuff. I think that's the bigger picture that I think providers have to learn to live without. So I want to be sure those housing authorities are doing the same thing, and I want to be sure architects are figuring out how to build good things, and make sure that business people are figuring out how to get good jobs. But I think from our narrow perspective, we have to treat healthcare as a right of all human beings, citizens or not, and treat them that way, and leave homelessness out of it. And that's our little wedge of the solution.
yeah, Jim makes a very important point with that. Our expertise and our training is in healthcare. There was a lot of issues that we were fully unaware of in our training, and we learned as we went along. But we don't have the answers for policy, at least I don't, or what to do in society. I can offer observations of what I see as consequences of lack of these problems. But I think it's up to all of you to listen to our observations and see what they are, and then when you sit at the table with all the different things, as Jim says, instead of having all this separate funding, if everybody sits together in the same way and talks together, then you can learn what your consequences could be by the failure of these different things, instead of working in isolated little capsules.
If I could just add something very quickly. I had the opportunity of meeting with this woman who was working as a fellow at MIT, and she's from Puerto Rico, and she came and she asked me a question that I thought was a dream come true. She said, if you started doing this work all over again, what would you do differently? And the reason why she asked me that is because she was director of one of the very few shelters in San Juan for homeless people. They haven't started that whole system there yet, even though there's a pretty big housing problem. They've managed to do other things around it. They have more of our battered women's shelters, but for homeless people they have few. And I just thought, what a question from me, because when I started doing work in this area, and when I started working at a shelter, many of us thought if we just shelter enough families, eventually we won't have to be here because we'll take care of the problem. I mean, people will get housed, and we didn't realize that, it wasn't a leak. It was like an avalanche of snow that was behind us, and that we were just uncovering the surface of what people were suffering and what people were living through. So I told her, look 10 years ahead and think about if you want to have 170 shelters in your island, and then think about backing up from there and what you want to do, what you would consider success. Because I think we look now and we are horrified at the number of programs that we've established. They're needed, they save people's lives, but I don't think it's never what we intended to do. So I think to have the opportunity, the luxury to say, I'm at a starting point and I've seen what other people have done and I don't like it, what do I do differently? I think you really need to think about and be again in consultation with people who are in that situation to say, how are we going to measure our success 10 years from now? And those are really critical questions. I wish I had the opportunity to back up and ask them all over again.
Yes.
My name's Alan Steinert. I'm on the board of directors of CASPAR, which is a local Cambridge outfit, and also the Long Island shelter in Boston. Lisette, I wanted to bore in on you on the fact that you're working for the Boston Foundation. That's a bunch of relatively hard-nosed characters who don't give out their money lightly. And they've got to have some criteria for measuring whether the money is going down the drain or rat hole, or whether it's being spent on achieving their objectives. How do they measure it? What are their criteria? How do they know that they're getting something back for the investment that they're making? I hear Dr. Greer focused in on it pretty well in terms of medical outcome, but how do we do it in terms of homeless people who will never end up in homes?
Well, I think at this point I need to make a distinction between the Boston Foundation and the Fund for the Homeless, because I think this particular program to support homeless-led organizations has been set up in a way that it's very flexible. It's taking a high degree of risk with organizations that don't have a track record, have never fundraised before, have very weird sometimes decision-making structures, very informal. That's not usually the way the Boston Foundation works. So I want to emphasize that. This is sort of an alternative model to funding grassroots organizations. And the reason for doing it that way is because if we don't start doing it this way, we're not going to do it. I mean, we're going to have to wait 10 years down the line for these organizations to be established and at a level of development where then our money won't make as much of a difference as it can right now. So I just want to put that out. Linda can talk a little bit about this because she sits on the committee that reviews the proposals, but I'll tell you, it's hard. It's very hard. Sometimes we are giving money to organizations and we are doing it, sometimes you have to think of it as doing it to fund the process of people getting together, sharing ideas, sharing experiences, and if nothing else comes out of it, that's leadership that you're building. Those are people who are going to be enriched by that experience, and that is, you'll be able to tap into that kind of leadership in the future. The organization may not survive. You may not get a concrete result, after 6 months or a year of funding, and that's a very unusual way of looking at it from a foundation perspective. People want to know after year 3, what are the 12 things that you have accomplished, and, why should we continue to fund you, and it's limited funding. We haven't set up any of those kinds of guidelines. We've set up, it's money that you can use in any way that you want as long as it's within the purposes of a nonprofit organization. It's flexible in that, you don't have to have a specific structure. You need to have some systems of accountability, but you don't have to necessarily have a strict board of directors or do it in that way. There are some legal things that we need to comply with, which we can work around with the organizations, but I think that's, you're kind of, at times you have to think of it as funding human potential. And that may be all that you get out of it. We don't know that yet because it's a very new program. It's less than a year old, so maybe I'll come back, in a year or two and tell you how it went. I think that so far we've made very, very good decisions. Whether or not those organizations, some of them are going to survive, I don't know.
I'd like to thank our panel. I'm sorry to cut you off, Linda. I think people who would like to continue to talk to our panel, please come down, but particularly to Dr. Greer, who came from Miami, for Linda Johnson, for Lisette, and to Jim O'Connell, who I caught on the spur of the moment here and forced him to come up to the front. I'd like to close with 2 quick stories that give me hope. They're very short. One is I went to my son's class last year. He was 9. The kids were supposed to have drawn posters of their hope for the world. And there were a whole group of them that looked to me like very sterile cities with tall buildings. And I was talking to my son about them. I said, "What are these?" He said, "Oh, they're cities." And I said, "But there are no people there." He said, "Oh, you don't understand it. These are cities without homeless people." And a large share of the kids in the class had drawn posters just like this. Second story is from a meeting I was in yesterday where we're trying to think about how many students we're going to be having next year and how we're going to parcel them across classes. And as many of you know, some of us, those of us in the Wiener Center in particular, are losing a lot of faculty to Washington, D.C. And I was greeted with the news of, I hate to tell you this, but the #1 issue for next year is homelessness and poverty. We haven't seen this in years. These are on student applications for the MPP program. So perhaps there is some hope. Thank you very much.
please.
No, anytime.